Thank you for coming over here. We've got two amazing scholars here to educate us on a lot of issues that we all feel are really important to us. First up is Dr. Rohlinger. She can talk broadly about social movements, strategy, and history. Dr. Polivka is going to go next, and he's going to talk about whatever he wants to talk about. Policy issues broadly. So, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank them for coming. Thank you. All right.
Yes. Thanks everyone for having me. I'll just be really brief. Basically what I thought would be the most useful is, as you probably can imagine, I either talk about really narrow things to smart people like yourselves that have PhD, which requires me to use big words, or I talk to roomfuls of people where I have to test them on it, and so they may be more or less interested. So what I thought I would do is just talk about what are some of the successful components of social movements, and then you could just tell me what you're interested in learning more about, and I can tell you some historical examples or tell you examples from my own research. So I'll just go over some of those really quickly. One of the first and most important things that you folks have been watching sort of the news of the movement since it started last month is successful movements have a clear target and they have goals, short-term and long-term. And the big goal is, of course, always a very lofty one, which they can't always achieve, but there's smaller goals all along the way. And this is important for a lot of reasons. Not only because for all of you folks, you want to know that what you're doing is getting you where you want to go, but also for external audiences so that they can say, okay, this isn't just a group of people. We've all seen lots of coverage where it's here's this group of people, it's not really clear what they want, where they're going. And by making clear goals along the way for the short term and the long term, it makes you more powerful because they can see success. Another thing is, of course, a clear structure, which is hard when you talk about consensus groups. And I think one of the things that history teaches us is when you have consensus groups, trying to figure out not only how to deal with differences of opinion that might come up, but when you have groups and you have point people, finding ways to make them visible to external audiences. Oh, God. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Okay, is that better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so trying to make yourselves visible, your groups visible, so you have a sense of the different groups that you have, right? So donations, food, sanitation, I can't remember all of them, education, media. It needs to be not only transparent to you all, but to external audiences. One of the things that I noticed just when I was here last night is the reporters wandering around, right, trying to decide who to talk to. You want to be able to funnel them to the people that you want them to talk to. Yeah. Even closer? Oh, okay. Sorry. I am new to the bullhorn experience. Okay, so did you hear that stuff about the... Okay, one of them. No? Okay, so your structure needs to be clear to external audiences. So last night, for example, there was someone walking around looking for donations. I immediately asked, is this someone that's associated with the movement? Or is it just somebody random saying, hey, here's an opportunity to get $1 for myself, right? So whether it's color coding, whether everyone wears the same color t-shirt, if it's name tags, whatever it is, transparent structure for internal and external publics helps you succeed. And I'll come back to the media stuff again. And the structure is also important for dealing, again, with differences. One of the strengths of movements like this is that you have a lot of diversity. Diversity also can create points of contention. So consensus is great, but you also have to think about other ways in which you can deal with these differences, whether it's breakout committees where you have folks that represent, different race, ethnicity, different age groups, whatever it is. You need to have a structure in which you can deal with these issues. of course, successful movements use media to their advantage, right? So some of it is simply during events, right? So something like a walkie-talkie was really helpful during Arab Spring. And this is simply because they were able to talk to authorities and see how the authorities wanted them to move. So we have our nice police officers with TPD, and if they want you to do something, it's very helpful for you and them if you can communicate with them and then ultimately with one another. If things were to get ugly, which they have historically, not saying they would here, it's useful to have these phones, cameras, in which you're documenting events and how they unfold. So again, this can serve as protection in a variety of ways, especially if you have opponents come in, because one of the things opponents will do, particularly if they're dealing with a larger crowd, is they will come in small numbers, hope to pick a fight, so then the movement, the larger group, looks like the fools, right? Look, they're bullies, they picked on us, they beat us up, they pushed us around. So all of these things are very important to document and think about. After events, of course, sharing your success, what you've done. You know, folks are making really good use now of Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr. These things are great, other Indian media outlets, and you gotta figure out ways, successful movements figure out how to deal with the mainstream media. And the easiest way to do this is you provide them with things they know. You understand that they have routine. They are looking for people that look professional. If you don't give them someone that looks familiar and give them sound bites they can use, then they will do whatever they want. And the more extreme groups seem, the better news that is. So oftentimes it's not even about the particular movement, it's about a movement's failure to present themselves in a way that's familiar and useful. And this is actually something I won't go on about, but it's one of the areas that I study quite a bit, so I can tell you more about that if you're interested. Successful movements take advantage of their opportunities. Some of these can be cultural, some of these can be making connections within the community, and some are political. And I think the political ones are a bit harder now because there's not an election coming up, right? So movements have to find ways to take advantage of any opportunities they can to not only build connections, but to remain visible, particularly if you want to have any kind of impact over the long term. And two more points. Finding ways to make your success visible to a broader public. The longer movements are around, the more difficult in some ways it is to show people that they're still relevant. And so this is one of the things that all movements have to contend with. Showing that they're successful, even if these successes are small, and remaining visible. And then of course, finding ways to deal with your opponents effectively. Opponents can be good in some instances, like dealing with media, right? Knowing that there's another side makes it easy for mainstream media in particular to cover it, right? But they also can create a host of problems as well that movements have to think about. So those are the basic components of successful movements. What are you all interested in knowing more about?
I know that this movement has its roots kind of the way that they've been organizing it. They've been using like the Arab Spring tactics.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I just had a question. I just had a question.
Well, say it loud.
All right. I know that we're all using like I guess you can call it the Arab Spring tactic. That's what it's being called usually, because we're using a lot of social media to really get our voices out and really get people to draw attention. How can we adopt some of the positive aspects of that movement into what we're doing here today?
Well, so the question hopefully you all heard is about the social media. Well, I think, some of this is up for debate how much social media actually played a role. So in the actual important events. So that's something to keep in mind. We can't overstate the importance of the internet. This is something folks are studying in including myself, how does the internet matter? How does it change participation? And we need to be able to exploit the advantages of technological resources, but without making sure that we're not relying completely on them. And at the end of the day, it takes making connections with people in communities face to face to get something that's lasting, right? So you can use social media for initial networking to get people involved, to get them excited, create the spark that you need more.
Does anybody else have a question? Yep, question.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. We could squeak out.
Anybody can't hear? There's some more space up front.
Yeah, move closer if you can't hear.
There's a lot of space up
Do what you
here.
need to do. Don't be idiots.
Yeah, go project.
I guess kind of a common question here is in places where it gets more hot with the police and with law enforcement, what is a good tactic? I actually am from Tampa, and I got word via Facebook that the city of Tampa is actually attempting to draft legislation that would limit the occupiers' ability to do that there. If they're able to do that, and in the event that law enforcement gets more hot and it's more difficult to stay here without the risk of like being arrested or such and such, what would you recommend how would you recommend we act in light of that?
So the
How's that for an answer?
okay, so we were talking about police, and now we got your attention. So I think that there's different sets of conditions. But one question is, how do you deal with authorities, but when things are going smoothly? And one of the most important short-term and long-term things successful movements do is they have a liaison. They have people, established people that deal with the authorities on a regular basis that are communicating. Once you have more contention involved and politicians decide that they want to intervene and create legislation that will do this, what you do is all you can really do is go to the media. All you can really do is talk about what democracy is and what freedom of expression is, and tie it to that. Make arguments that appeal to broad audiences and are not particularistic, because I was listening to, we'll just say, a very well-known conservative radio host on the way over to hear what he was saying about the movement, and it's really, basically all he says is, okay, well, they're just trying to loot the rich. So this is a bunch of socialists that are trying to loot the rich. And this is an important argument to know that's being made, right? Because then you craft arguments to appeal to a broader public that refute this and say, like the signs say, this is not about, socialism, this is about freedom of expression, this is about democracy. And ultimately they have the power, right? They can write legislation. So take it to the people.
Questions? Interests?
Hello? Can you guys hear me better like this?
Yes.
Okay. My question mainly is, where do we go from here? I guess it goes to like the leaders of the movement. Like, my thought is, okay, we're informing people of what we're doing now, but how are we actually going to change the mind of these legislators, like these representatives of people? Do we plan on, going and actually setting up meetings with people and trying to talk to them, or are we just going to sit out here and have them discredit us? Like, this is a great way to inform them, but we have to do something to actually change their minds now. So I guess whoever can answer, what do you think our next move should be as far as actually getting things to change?
And there you have the $1 million question, right? No, I mean, I think that's an extraordinarily important question, and this is where the next step is. But who are the targets what are the goals, what are short-term and long-term goals. And these are very long, difficult conversations that movements have to have. And these are things you'll just have to sort of start discussing, and the sooner the better, because as you noted, if a movement doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, then people will go, right? If they don't feel like there's lots of energy, but the energy isn't going in any direction, then they go home. So this is the question that you all have to deal with.
Thank you, Dina.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me okay like this?
Yeah.
I'll keep it handy. The question of what do you do? I'll try to connect to that to some of the stuff I was going to talk about and change it up a little bit. You know, we are all suffering from 30 years of economic policy and politics that has accrued almost exclusively to the benefit of the 1% or the 1/10 of 1%. The 99% is a profoundly accurate way to describe the way the goods in this society have been divided up over the last 30 years, increasingly so over the last 10 or 12. The question then is, or the issue that we really have to confront is, how did we get here? How did we get in such a position where we've had 30 years of declining wages for working people? 30% of all men between 20 and 60 make 30% less today than 40 years ago. How did we get here? And we have greater inequality than we've had probably since the 1890s. We weren't measuring it back then, but we certainly have greater inequality now than before the last Depression, 1929. How did we get here? This is something that anybody participating in this movement, anybody concerned about how we got here and how we can change it so we can have a more equitable society, a society where prosperity is not limited to a small minority, you have to understand. We have to understand how we got here. And that takes effort. That takes self-education. That takes talking to others. That takes educating the broader public just as much as you possibly can. Now, some of you here participated in the anti-war movement, civil rights movement 40, 50 years ago. And that also involved a major educational effort. People had to come to understand what the problem was and where it came from. In the case of Vietnam, there really wasn't a broad-based movement against the war until about 67, 68, even though the war had been escalated, and 65 had been underway for many years before that. There was this media notion that we had to fight in Vietnam in order to keep the Chinese from taking over the world and taking over California. Heaven knows, they've got it now, haven't they? But that took an effort for people to begin to question the received wisdom of the time that was coming through the media as much as it is today. One of the advantages you have today is that you have alternative media. I don't want to overplay that. Alternative media alone will not change this situation, nor did it bring revolution to Egypt to the extent that they haven't so far. But it's an important resource that we did not, and others who participated in those movements back then did not have. But the issue of educating yourself and others is still very much the same. And to some extent, it's more difficult and more challenging. This isn't as difficult as it was to get a handle on why we were in Vietnam. In the course of history that led us into Vietnam, this is even more complicated, but probably even more critical to more lives. Because this is affecting everybody, the 99%, right? So we have to understand how we got here. There are some shorthand bits of information I think are useful in beginning to craft that message, and I'll just spell out briefly in a summary way some of those today. We got here as a result of 30 years of what's called neoliberal economic policy. Neoliberal means conservative economic policy. That means cutting taxes, especially on wealth. That means deregulating the corporate sector, especially Wall Street. That means privatizing everything you can possibly get your hands on to hand over to your corporate donors so they can make a profit off of it. and then reduce access to the general public in the process for the education, the social services, or health care, or what have you. And a whole bunch of so-called free trade policies, you know, especially NAFTA, which occurred under a Democratic president, that has resulted in a steady drain of jobs out of this country. I mean, who would have known? Ross Perot was right. Giant sucking sound. That's what happened. Al Gore promised us it wouldn't, but it did. And now, just this week, we see 3 more free trade policies that are going to continue to drain jobs in the absence of what is called an industrial policy. One of the things about neoliberalism, and I'll talk about it in just a second in the new program, is that they oppose government involvement, at least to the extent that it helps ordinary people. They love government involvement when it covers their losses on stock in the stock market. They want to privatize the gains, socialize the losses, and our government's been pretty good at that for the past several years. What it has not been good at is creating jobs here. You can have free trade, but you've got to have investments at home. You've got to have investments in education, in training, in infrastructure, research and development, and this isn't some abstract concept. This has been occurring around the world in other countries for 30 years. Germany, the leading exporter in the world, also has a massive industrial policy. They have continued to make big investments in education steadily over the last several decades. They have up-to-date, really world-class infrastructure, which keeps their productivity at high levels. And they also have really supportive social policies. They have very high unemployment. They have retirement security that we can only dream of here. Their Social Security system replaces 90% of the last wage that a person makes. Here it's 40% and going down. So you can have a very productive economy with an relatively equitable distribution of the gains of that economy and also have a high growth economy. We've had none of that. Under neoliberalism, with money and wealth steadily going to the top 1%, we've had a steady decrease in growth rates over this period of time, bumping downwards. From about 3.5% before neoliberalism became the regime in power to under 2%. Well, what was it in the last 2 quarters? Under 1%. Now, the problem now is that neoliberalism has failed. That's where the Great Recession that we're in the middle of, with no end in sight, came from. Obama was elected on the notion that he was going to offer an alternative vision, an alternative policy agenda. He started sort of in that direction with the stimulus program that was about half the size it should have been. It was 1/4 the size of China's stimulus, and you see where China is now with their growth rates. Some regulation of Wall Street, but shying away entirely from breaking up too big to fail, which is the core issue. I don't care what kind of regulatory strategy you have in place. If you've got 5 banks controlling 60% of all the wealth, they will eventually do whatever they want to do, and you will bail them out again. Obama even began to back away from that, though, in 2010, leading up to and coming out of the 2010 election. And most recently, until the jobs bill, he actually embraced austerity, which is a doubling down on neoliberalism, fundamentally. And if you think we've had a rough 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, wait for the next 10 years. I mean, we will really see what it means to have a lost decade on top of one that's already never found. If the policies that are in place or seem to be gaining power are implemented, cutting the budget. I mean, what's the worst thing you can do in a recession like this where you've got such a depression of demand? Is to cut the public sector. The private sector is not producing any demand. It has to come from the public sector. History shows us that. What 2 countries are right now following a strict austerity policy of the kind that Republicans have supported and that the President has at least tacitly supported for the past year. Britain and Ireland. And where are they? They're even deeper in the toilet than we are. And that's where we're headed with this kind of policy. So part of this educating effort is to make sure people understand how we got here, some of the sources I've just briefly described, and to talk about an alternative agenda of the kind that I and many, I think, expected from Obama. And that would involve essentially 4 things, and these could be things that will eventually become major issues. Republican Party, they're going the other way as fast as they can. You're not really going to get it from the Democrats unless they get enormous pressure sustained over time from this movement. And really what we need to do is talk about how this country has to have an industrial policy. We have to begin to reinvest in the real productive economy that makes things and doesn't. An economy that doesn't have all the money, all the profits drained off to Wall Street where they're put into a casino with speculative finance and ends up crashing the entire economy. We can't do that, but that's the course we're on to repeat at this moment. So we need an industrial policy that bumps up both private and public investment in education, training, improved health care. Have you seen where health care has been headed? You notice last year we are now 46th in life expectancy, but we cost 50% more than any other healthcare system in the world.